to officially hand over to you, Alex, for the next 30 minutes to really take us through the things that you think are important for a group like this to be inspired and to gain insight for their organisations.
Cool, great, excellent. Thanks, Wendy. Thanks for the intro, and hi everyone. I think that I've been introduced to everyone, but I thought today what might be useful is just to have a chat about the world's obsession with data and the environment that we're in, and some of the lessons that we can learn in terms of strategy. So Wendy mentioned I wrote a book last year called Thriving in Complexity, the art and science of discovering opportunity in the new normal was the tagline. And it's almost a little bit embarrassing now because I thought the new normal was a really cool and edgy thing to say back then, last June, and now everyone's talking about the new normal and it feels a bit passé. And the one that I'm writing now, or co-writing actually, there's 18 other authors, is it's got a working title of What the Hell Do We Do Now? But I don't think that's going to be the publication title, but it's about how organisations can emerge from COVID in a better position than they entered it. And so there's sort of what I might talk about is just the way that my thinking's evolved over the last year or so, and maybe we'll go through one of the tools that futurists use that might be useful for you in this environment. So I know Mel's sort of familiar with a couple of these. So for your benefit, Mel, I'm going to cover one of the futurist tools that we didn't use when we were working together, and one that I think is particularly appropriate right now. So when I was thinking about this thriving in complexity, as Wendy said, my background is in data, in econometrics and in software for workforce strategy. And back when Wendy and I were working together, we were working for a whole range of different organisations, but that company or aspects, most of our clients were US and UK based. And often with very, very large data sets. So the largest client we had about 300,000 staff, and the smallest US-based client we had I think it was 6,000 or 7,000. And then the Australian and New Zealand clients had significantly less than that. So a really big part of our market and how we sort of designed that software was from very large data sets of workforces. And there's been a bit of an obsession with data in the era of big data for the last few years around how data can be used to unlock insights about consumers, but also about employees as well. And so for example, there was this great story a few years ago, some of you might have heard it about Target. What Target was trying to do was to, and this is US Target. So in the US, Target was trying to lock up new parents because they're a really profitable and really loyal consumer segment. So if you start buying nappies or baby powder or formula or bottles from Target, chances are you're going to keep buying them from Target till you don't need them anymore. Or if you buy them from Coles or Walmart or Costco or whatever it happens to be. And so the problem is that where you would start buying baby products was pretty much random. You just walk into whichever store you were in, start buying baby products, but then they would have this highly loyal, highly profitable consumer segment. And so what Target tried to do was to figure out who might be pregnant and send them catalogues with discount codes for baby products to lock up that loyalty of this really profitable and loyal consumer segment. So they started using big data. This is one of the early case studies in big data. And they had a look at purchase patterns in the 9 months before people signed up for a baby registry and came up with an algorithm that was fairly predictive. It was about 70 to 80% predictive of who might be pregnant. And actually they could date the pregnancy, so they could figure out which trimester you were in. And so what they did was they sent out these catalogues with discount coupons to people that they thought might be in their third trimester of pregnancy. And the idea was to get those people into Target and lock up that consumer segment. And so there were all sorts of factors that they found in the data. If you suddenly switched from scented to unscented products, if you started buying things in bulk, Perhaps not surprisingly, if you started buying, fluffy blankets, particularly if they were blue or pink, but there were about 100 odd different data points that they thought was predictive of pregnancy. And the reason that this became public is they sent out a catalogue. The algorithm spat out the names, and because they had essentially flybys data and credit card data, they had the addresses as well. So they sent out a catalogue to a 15-year-old girl in Minnesota, and this is when it sort of became clear what they were doing. So the father of the 15-year-old girl was not very happy and went into a Target store and spoke to the customer service person, was very angry, and obviously the customer service person at the store didn't know what was going on, so sent an inquiry up through the chain, and the same man came back in 3 days later to apologise, because it turns out that his 15-year-old daughter was pregnant, and Target knew before he did. And so for the last sort of 15, 20 years, examples like that of companies using data, and particularly in the age of Amazon and Facebook and Twitter and so on, and particularly Google, the vast majority of those companies' revenues are just from personal data that they have about us. So in the case of Facebook and Google, they give us free services because we're actually the product. And so it's in that sort of context that I started analysing some really large data sets and trying to predict the future based on data for some really large organisations, and that's where I worked with Wendy. The problem is that we were always wrong. So we were really precise, but we were always wrong. The data was right, but the world was changing. And I think that's a really important lesson for us, particularly now in the environment that we're in. There's a bit of an obsession with data in organisations, and that applies to workforce data as well as consumer data. But when the world's changing, you don't have any data. All the data we have is about the past, and all the decisions we make around the future. We actually saw that earlier this year with COVID, when there were people saying flu kills more people every year than COVID does. Well, yeah, because COVID's new and growing exponentially. So that wasn't true for very long, and it's certainly not true now. When we make decisions in organisations based on data, I think what's happening is, I'm just going to switch to another camera and sort of draw this up because it's easier talking through it. So hopefully you can see a whiteboard now.
Would it help if we all adjusted to speaker view, Alex, and that gives us a bigger...
Oh, yeah. Yeah, if you're not in speaker view already, that'd be great. So, with a lot of strategy, including workforce strategy, if you think about this spectrum from looking back to the past to looking to the future, and then here we talk about sustaining operations up to building new competitive advantage. When we have this kind of obsession with data, then what we're often doing is we're looking to the past and we're trying to sustain the status quo. And so this is really about repeating what we've done in the past. And so this is where we use case studies and where we use best practice and where we do things because we've always done them that way. We're basically just repeating what we've done in the past. And there's a place for that, but it can't be all we do, and particularly in a changing world. So when we look to the future, the world's changing and we get some disruptions, and we're still trying to maintain the status quo and sustain our operations. What we often do is we react to the latest trend. And so can someone give me an example of a trend that's become really big in workforces in the last few years that everyone sort of jumped on the bandwagon?
Work from home. I don't know if it's in the past few years. It's been around for a while, but I know that hot desking was a trend, and now that COVID's come into play, it's now being made obsolete in global companies.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So I heard too, they're working from home and hot desking. So if we look at how we react to working from home, the reason we can work from home is because the location of knowledge work, so knowledge work and its location have been separated out, or it's possible to separate them out. And in fact, during the last few months, every organisation that can has actually severed that tie, possibly permanently. And so when we react to working from home and we put in place a working from home policy, but we don't change anything about how we recruit or staff or manage or lead, then, or measure performance for that matter, then we're reacting to that trend and we don't get the full benefit of it. So what that means is we allow some people to work from home, but we still hire people within a commuting distance of the office. But what is behind that trend of working from home is this disintermediation between knowledge work and its location. And once you really leverage the possibilities of that, what that means is you can get the best talent wherever they are in the world. It's just that you need to manage people differently, measure performance differently, let go of the face time requirement. And a lot of organisations have proved that they were able to do that in the last few years. And so instead of reacting to that, now the opportunity is actually to use that trend and reframe what it means to manage an organisation in a world where knowledge work and its location don't need to be one and the same. And the hot desking is another good example of this. So hot desking, I think a lot of the drivers for hot desking and activity-based work are basically cost savings. So how do we get rid of real estate costs and reduce having square footage in an office? And what you do if you just sort of react to that trend, it's other people are doing it, we should do it too, but you don't actually think about the cultural implications and the psychological safety implications is it's going to fail. So there's a reason why people put photos of their family at their desks and they put, they personalise their desks and they sit next to the same people all the time. It's about psychological safety. It's about making that place your own. And if you're going to spend 40 or in some cases more hours a week, 25% of your time at an office, you probably don't want it to be depersonalised. So the organisational psychologists, if you ask one of those around hot desking, and I have, and I'm not sure they all have the same answer, but I certainly spoke to a organisational psychologist around hot desking who said it's a terrible idea because actually what you're doing is removing the personification of someone's workplace, and they spend so much time there that you're basically dehumanising the workplace. So the trend that we reacted to is other people are doing this to save costs, but we actually need to figure out other ways of then, I'm saying hot desking would never work, it's just that you need to complement the personification of the workplace and giving people psychological safety. There was a study a couple of years ago at Google called Project Aristotle that talked about what high-performing teams look like. And the most important element of high-performing teams is psychological safety. And so if you're not really careful, if you just react to a trend like hot desking, you can actually remove the most important element for high-performing teams, which seems like a pretty terrible idea to me. And so reframing as opposed to reacting is where you're looking to the future, but you're actually leveraging trends, not just reacting to them. So this is where you become the kind of organisation that other people copy. But you need to apply your own context and you need to really go deep and understand those trends. And if we're looking to the past but building competitive advantage, then what we're doing is we're using data to actually refine our initiatives. And so a really good example of where we sort of consistently fail to do this is with engagement. So we have engagement surveys. They're one of the few lead indicators that are available to people and culture. And they're meant to be predictive of lower voluntary turnover and higher productivity. But we never measure that because the consultants come in and tell you that you won't get a very high response rate if they're not anonymous. And so trust us, we've got all this data from the last 30 years, some of which is from steel mills in Canada. showing that there's a link between high engagement and higher productivity and lower turnover. So it must work in every context because it worked in that one organisation we did a study on 30 years ago on the other side of the world. So the opportunity is to actually use data to prove that. So know the degree to which, for example, engagement actually works and where it works in the organisation. That allows you to refine your initiatives and be a lot more effective. So the reason I show you this is because I think if you were to reflect on what most P&C initiatives, what most HR initiatives are, they're about best practice, which is repeating what we've always done or what other people have done, or they're reacting to the latest trend, and that's it. And so those two, there's exceptions, but predominantly I would suggest that most HR strategies, most workforce strategies only incorporate those two, maybe a little bit of the other two, but not much. And what those are about is sustaining the status quo. But we are in a world right now which is changing rapidly, incredibly rapidly, and there is no normal to sustain. The whole world's changing, we need to change with it. And so I think we need to really look at how we test our initiatives with data and how we actually leverage trends in order to reframe what our workforce looks like in a changing world. Does that make sense? Anyone got any questions on that?
Yeah, it is, Alex. I'm just wanting to ask whether you think there's a risk appetite for moving above the horizontal, and as some of the constraining factors, meaning the people we have to convince as P&C professionals to move above that horizontal.
Yeah, it's a really good question, Wendy. I'm not sure, like, everyone wants innovation, but no one wants to change. It's a really common sort of finding in this. But I actually think we have for want of a better term, you've got a burning platform now. So let's call it a catalyst. And actually what we have as a catalyst is this opportunity where, I think of this as, Dark Side of the Moon, Pink Floyd album. It's got a prism on it and there's light coming in and there's light coming out the other side. And so actually what I think is that's a terrible prism.
Are we showing our age here, Alex, by knowing that?
Yeah, maybe. So you've got this light coming in. What happens as light goes into a prism is it actually refracts. So it concentrates and it reflects some light back. And so I think if you think about the environment we're going in now as a prism, then we get to leave behind the practices that no longer work and we get to focus down on those ones that do work. And out the other end, we generate a spectrum of opportunities, which is about the future. So I think your question's relevant. I think people don't want to change, but they do want to innovate. And sometimes it takes them to be forced into an environment where they have to change. And so I think about working from home and all the organisations that have been resistant to that, but also look at, say, telehealth. Wendy, you and I were talking about this the other day. Telehealth has been proposed in like the 1980s, but there's been funding issues with it, there's been policy issues with it, and it took a catalyst to actually bring telehealth to be mainstream. Or if you think about education, the School of the Air has been around since 1951, teaching people remotely. So before the first television broadcast in Australia, we've had remote education here. We just haven't had it in urban areas until COVID became a catalyst for doing that. And that gives us huge opportunities moving forward too, if we are to stay the course, and it looks like we won't, which I think is a missed opportunity, because imagine having the people who wrote the textbook teaching the kids, doing a lecture to all the kids, and then having a hybrid model where you've got some digital and some physical education. I think there's huge opportunities that we sort of miss out on if we don't use this as a catalyst. So it's a very long way of answering your question, but I think the answer is no, there's not a lot of appetite for it, but this might be the best opportunity we have right now to talk about how much the world's changing. Which sort of brings me to an exercise which might be helpful. How are we going for time, Wendy? Well, I think you're unmuting it.
I think we've got about another 10 minutes.
Cool. All right.
Some Q&A for you.
Okay, excellent. All right, let's spend 10 minutes on this exercise, which could be useful for thinking about the real future of work. So I reckon the problem with the future of work is if you Google the future of work, you're going to get hot desking and working from home, and you're going to get increasing flexibility and a range of other things. And so working from home was first proposed in the 1960s. In fact, there's this great TV ad from, I think it's British Telecom, about the future home office in the year 2000. And yeah, it's quite funny how they imagined the future of the home office was going to look. And they were going to have video phones by then, which would have been amazing. As it was very science fiction back then. I reckon the problem with the future of work is that when we talk about the future of work, usually we're talking about things that have been around for decades. And working from home is one of them. And so the reason that I think we have a problem with that is it's actually hard to imagine the future from a position of today. So the reason we know about trends is because they're already here. And in order to look ahead, there's a couple of exercises that futurists use. One of them is environment scanning. So I know Wendy and Mel, you're familiar with this. I'm sure a number of others are as well. So this is about looking outside your organisation, which would be sort of a micro environment, into a macro environment, which is societal level, and then a meso environment, which is sort of the industry that you're in and how work is changing and so on. But the flip side of that is this idea about thinking about implications. So when we do environment scanning, we look at 6 categories. We look at demographics, economics, government policy, the environment, socio-cultural change, and technology. And we look at how changes in those domains might change our organisation, our industry, and our workforce. With the futures wheel, you're looking at the implications of that. So what I want to ask you is to just run through this exercise with me, because if we want to understand the future of work, that's going to be shaped by COVID. And we don't really know how it's going to be shaped by COVID, but it's going to be shaped by a whole bunch of different trends too. Technology changes, quantum computing, driverless cars, they're all going to have, any major trend is going to have implications for work. So what I want to do is just walk through this exercise where we think about the implications of COVID, and then we can bring it back to what this means for your organisations. So COVID, what might be some of the demographic implications of COVID? Has anyone got an idea of that?
Maybe delayed retirement age, because people are now considering their portfolio.
Yep, absolutely. Delayed retirement age. Yep. And what about economically? What's an economic implication?
Higher unemployment.
Yep, higher unemployment, which might make it easier to find certain skills, but typically unemployment might impact different parts of the economy. So it might impact perhaps, say, hospitality workers disproportionately as opposed to other parts of the economy. It's probably not going to help much in acute shortages of nurses in healthcare, for example, but it might help in other areas, other parts of the economy. Yeah.
Can I just ask a high-level question? Why are all those things, when you're looking at futuristic, external factors, and we don't consider the internal human factor?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Okay, so, hang on. So can you rephrase that last part?
So we're thinking about the future of work, and we're thinking about all of these demographic, economic, government policies, socioeconomic things, which are all external. my experience in talking to the people that I am and my networks are, everyone's having this internal awakening, emotional, spiritual, family matters, etc. And it's a very internal human awakening that's going to impact work.
So that's the society and culture piece. So it is covered, but it's really interesting you raise that because Wendy mentioned I'm writing another book now, and that is actually around the hero's journey. And so there's two versions of the hero, or there's a few versions of the hero's journey, but the traditional hero's journey that most people are familiar with is the Joseph Campbell from A Hero with 1,000 Faces. And it's very masculine. It's about conquest, so it's typically to get a treasure or slay a dragon or something like that. So Star Wars and Lord of the Rings follow that narrative arc. But there's another version, which is the heroine's journey, which is more Wizard of Oz, for example, follows this. And what it is where it's not always female, but it's feminine journey, is that the heroine is thrown into a different world, doesn't seek one out, and it's a journey of values and principles to come out the other side and transform the world. So if you've seen The Wizard of Oz, for example, when Dorothy goes back to Kansas, basically no one else has changed, but she has. And so that changed the world. So good question. I think the socio-cultural element does cover the human side. And also it's worth sort of keeping in mind that both delayed retirements, for example, and increasing unemployment have social ripples. So those ripples have ripples, and they're social as well. But good question. Okay, so what about, say, environment? What might be some environmental impacts?
Increased congestion, more traffic as people avoid public transport.
Yeah, sure.
And then I guess on the other side of that, people travelling less interstate and overseas using, and that sort of, I guess, flows onto the technology aspect as well, but, you know, potentially less travel in some areas.
Absolutely. Yep. And
increased fossil fuel consumption.
Yep. So in some ways increasing, and then in some ways decreasing fossil fuels. And each of these ripples is going to have ripples as well. So before we get into that though, society and culture, how are values shifting and how are you seeing communities change in light of the environment that we're in right now?
I think there's certainly a gender equality or gender balance going on with shared care of parental things, and that's impacting positively for work-life balance in workplaces.
Okay. Work-life balance, yeah.
Arguably the opposite can be true though too, because we're not able to rely on grandparents to provide that line of support anymore at the moment as well. So the opposite can also be impacted.
Yeah.
So a decreased reliance on extended family.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. And what about technology?
Zoom calls and I guess that becoming the way we interact and hold meetings. So the need to use technology much more.
Well, it's just the online infrastructure, isn't it? The ability to easily adapt to that.
Yeah, yeah. And so we've sort of been forced through this learning curve, and so a lot more people have some basic tech literacy than did 3 months ago because they've had to. So each of these ripples is going to have its own ripples, and they might be demographic and so on. And from the ones you've told me, they all kind of link back to the workforce. So if I'm to think about the future of work as it relates to the implications of COVID, these are the kind of things I want to think about. And this gives me a lot more depth in having sort of a rationale why I think work is going to change, and then making some decisions around what to do with it. So hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully that's useful. But I think I'm kind of out of time. what I might do is just sort of maybe if everyone wants to, if you would like a copy of my book, which covers this and other topics, then perhaps if you let Wendy know and just give her a postal address, well, I'll send you out a copy with my compliments to the people.
Oh, wow.
In this group.
That's really kind, Alex. Thank you.
Thank you.
Didn't realise we would all go away with a gift, as well as some thought-provoking and insightful ways of tackling some of these issues. How fantastic.
Yeah.
Thanks, Alex.
You're always a
Thank
sweetie.
you. That's very generous. Thank you.
You just like Ellen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What was that?
Just like Ellen, we've all come away with something. I've been on the Ellen
That's
show.
right. Yeah, it'd be pretty creepy if I said, if you look under your chairs.
Does anyone have any questions to Alex before he makes his graceful exit? Anyone have any questions?
I just wondered, Alex, if there was any, and this is, I guess, more of a curious question, anything that you sort of feel is going to be dropped to the wayside given the focus on COVID? So I guess, you know, a lot of organisations focusing on sustainability and corporate responsibility and those sort of positive things, those types of things might get sort of pushed to the sideline. If there's any, you had any sort of thoughts?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So particularly as it relates to sustainability, I think that could go one of two ways. I hope that the way that it will go is we've kind of had a bit of an awakening, because if you think about, and actually, so the first chapter in this book that's about to come out is from a gentleman by the name of Dr. Richard Hodge, and he has his PhD is in systems thinking, and he's got this sort of obsession, really, I guess he wouldn't mind me calling it, with the fact that this is the century that we need to get it together as a species, otherwise we lose our chance. And so he talks about how basically most organisations, you'll have your primary focus is shareholder value, the economy, and then you might have corporate social responsibility programs, and some of those might be on the environment. But if you actually think about how the world works, we have a planet, it has a society, and a part of that society is the economy. So we've got it completely the wrong way around. And when I think about some of the changes that have happened just in the last few months, and some of the trends that have been accelerated in the last few months, one of them is, if I was to ask last year, what's a kind of edgy idea on what the future of work might look like, then occasionally people would talk about universal basic income. And universal basic income is essentially everyone gets paid more or less the same amount of money without a work test, and so it's enough technically to live on, and there's no disincentive for also seeking work, but also you could live just on that universal basic income without having to go through all the sort of requirements that being on the unemployment queue puts on you. But and there's been experiments of this in Finland and Canada, and Alaska's had a negative tax, which is basically a universal basic income for decades. Because of the oil royalties. But here in Australia, the conversation has always been as completely impractical. You know, we couldn't possibly do that, and it would disincentivise people to work, and it would be a disaster for the economy. But we've just doubled job seeker and introduced job keeper for a few months. And so while it's not universal, we have essentially put people before profit in a really telling way. And I think that value shift as a society, that when we have to, we will put people before profit. And perhaps we can continue that on, not with JobKeeper or universal basic income necessarily, but I think the value shift, that when it comes down to it, we can put people over profit, and hopefully the planet over profit as well. I think perhaps we can carry that on. There'll be a whole bunch of thinking coming out when we start to emerge from this about how likely it is that tropical diseases will increase in a world of global warming, for example. And so people have been devastated by this and the economy's been devastated by this, there actually might be a for-profit reason to look after the planet. And there are for-profit reasons to look after the planet. So, yeah, in the short term, people don't invest in green initiatives in recessions. There's a really high correlation between investment and prioritisation of green initiatives and how the economy is going, particularly GDP. So in the short term, we might get some deprioritisation, but in the long term, I think maybe there's a value shift that mandates that. I don't know.
I think you're right, Alex, and I think from an environmental standpoint, we are seeing green initiatives as a nice to have. From a politics perspective, a nice to have, not an essential to have, and I think there's been some movement on that, but will it be far enough for it to be a sustainable approach to this?
Yeah.
And the same for homelessness. You know, COVID has created an environment where we now place the homeless into hotel accommodations, and that's been a radical shift. It shows we can do it. It shows we've got the capacity when the times are tough, but will it be sustainable? And will the politicians of the day believe that that's a better benefit than the economic cost of doing so?
And it also,
I think ultimately,
it also takes away from some of the other initiatives. So Indigenous initiatives, for example, we've just had to drop all our focus on those things. And when they'll be picked up again, who really will know the answer to that? Because essentially we have to look after our core business. And unfortunately, that's not considered core.
Yeah.
So there are some issues. While things like homelessness might get picked up, there are some other things that are definitely going to drop off the agenda in terms of that social welfare.
Indeed.
I think that
despite the Black Lives Matter spotlight.
Yeah. I think both governments and corporations respond to their consumers and voters, and I suspect that it's actually up to all of us to talk about what is core business and to make the case that both diversity and looking after the planet are core business, and you know, vote with our votes or vote with our wallets for organisations that don't sort of legitimately address those things. But I do think it's really hard, you know, as a futurist, we try not to make predictions. We try to talk about possibilities, because making predictions is kind of a mug's game, and so you end up either being Nostradamus or a complete idiot, or sometimes both at the same time. But every action sort of has counter trends, and sometimes it's really hard to figure it out. So, for example, here's a bit of a mind twister for you. If Scott Morrison hadn't gone to Hawaii in January and been criticised for not taking the bushfires seriously, would we be in a much worse position with COVID than we are now? I reckon the answer is yes. I think if he wasn't criticised so widely for not taking bushfires seriously, we wouldn't have locked down as early as we did. And we'd be in a much worse position.
Getting on the front foot to be seen to be acting proactively.
Yeah. And so what did happen is we got global leadership from Jacinda Ardern, and Australia's policy followed theirs about 24 hours later. So we were, you know, probably second country in the world to actually really lock down early in terms of number of cases, not early in terms of chronologically. But I think, you know, everything that happens has both positive and negative consequences. And so I think, you know, ScoMo's trip to Hawaii probably had some really positive consequences that we couldn't have anticipated at the time. And I think that's true with every trend that we face.
Yeah, terrific. Can we thank Alex for giving us some really thought-provoking today? And thank you so much, Alex. Really appreciate you being part of it.
Thanks, Alex.
Thanks, Alex.
Nice to meet you all.
Thanks, Alex. Good to see you.
See you later. I can see you too.
Look forward to reading all about it.
Cool. All right. Thanks. Enjoy the rest of your time.